The sun hung over Redemption, Arizona, like a judge's gavel ready to fall. It beat down on the dust of the main street, a fine crimson powder that coated everything. The warped timber of the saloon, the false front of the mercantile, the sun-bleached bones of a steer half buried in sand at the edge of town. The air was thick with the smell of dust, sweat, and regret, the signature perfume of a place where men came to forget who they were or to die remembering. Jedediah Kane was trying to forget. He sat on a bench outside the land office, his broad shoulders slumped in a way that had become permanent over the last decade. His face, once handsome and sharp, was now a roadmap of grief etched by sun and sorrow. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, were fixed on nothing, seeing only the ghosts that danced in the heat shimmer. 10 years. 10 years since the fire, since the smoke and the screaming, since the day he had lost everything that mattered. He had been a U.S. Marshal then, a man of purpose and conviction. Now he was just Kane, a name whispered with a mixture of pity and old fear, a man haunted by the hero he was supposed to have been. He was trying to live a quiet life, a penance paid in silence and solitude. He did odd jobs enough to afford a room above the livery and a bottle to keep the nightmares at bay. He was a bystander now, a spectator to the small dramas of redemption, his gun belt gathering dust under his cot and the weight of it, a phantom limb he could still feel at his hip. The sudden crack of a gunshot shattered the afternoon's oppressive quiet. It was followed by another, then the splintering of wood and the panicked cry of a horse. People scattered, diving for cover behind water troughs and wagons. The air, once still, was now electric with violence. Jedediah didn't move. His body went rigid, his breath catching in his throat. The smell of gunpowder, sharp and acrid, filled his nostrils, and for a moment he wasn't in Redemption. He was back in the fire, the roar of the flames in his ears, the ghost of his wife's hand slipping from his. 4 men burst from the doors of the Redemption Bank and Trust, their faces obscured by bandanas. 3 were brutish and chaotic, firing their pistols into the air to sow fear. But the 4th, the leader, moved with a cold, terrifying precision. He was tall and slender, dressed in a black duster that seemed to absorb the punishing sunlight. He didn't waste bullets or motion. Every step was deliberate, every glance calculated. Jedediah's hand instinctively went to the empty holster at his hip, his knuckles white. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic prisoner rattling its cage. He should do something. The marshal he used to be would have already drawn, would have already acted. But that man was dead, burned to ash with his family. The man left in his place was a hollow shell frozen by the past. The townsfolk were paralyzed, cowering in the face of the robbers' aggression. The bank manager, a portly man named Henderson, stumbled out after them, his face pale with shock. "They took everything," he stammered to the empty street. "Everything." The leader paused, turning back slightly. He held up a small object that glinted in the sun. It wasn't a bag of money. It was a silver locket, oval-shaped and intricately engraved. Jedediah's breath hitched. His world narrowed to that single point of light, that small piece of silver. He knew that locket. He knew the delicate scrollwork, the tiny clasp. It had belonged to his wife, Sarah. It had been her mother's before her. After the fire, after he had buried her and their son, he had been broken and penniless. With a heart that felt like it was being torn from his chest, he had sold it to a traveling merchant to pay for her headstone. It was the last piece of her he had ever touched. The leader, the man in black, seemed to feel Jedediah's gaze. He turned his head slowly, his eyes cold and dark, above the bandana locking onto Jedediah's. For a long, silent moment, the chaos of the street faded away. There was no gunfire, no shouting, only the searing intensity of that stare. A flicker of something that looked like recognition or perhaps twisted satisfaction crossed the man's eyes. Then with a final, almost imperceptible nod, he swung onto his horse and spurted into a gallop, his gang thundering after him down the dusty street and out into the vast, unforgiving wilderness. The spell broke. The town exhaled a collective sigh of terror and relief. People began to emerge from their hiding places, their voices a low murmur that slowly grew into a clamor. Sheriff Brody, a man whose gut hung over his gun belt, like a testament to a life spent avoiding trouble, finally appeared, his face flushed. What happened? Are they gone? But Jedediah didn't hear him. He was on his feet, his body moving without conscious thought. The ice that had encased his heart for a decade had shattered, and in its place was a fire white hot and pure. That robbery wasn't about money. That man Silas Thorne, the name was on the wanted poster tacked to the sheriff's office wall, hadn't just stolen from a bank. He had stolen a memory. He had desecrated a grave. This wasn't a random crime. It was a message delivered across 10 years of silence and grief aimed directly at him. Jedediah Kane, the ghost of redemption, had just been called out. The quiet life was over. The manhunt was about to begin. And this time, it wasn't for justice. It was for vengeance. The dust settled, but for Jedediah, the world was still spinning. Sheriff Brody was trying to organize a posse. His voice a blustering mix of authority and panic that failed to inspire confidence. Men gathered, some eager for a fight, others merely curious, their faces a gallery of frontier hope and hardship. Jedediah ignored them all. His path was set, and it was a path he would walk alone. He strode to the livery, his steps long and purposeful, the slump gone from his shoulders. Inside the cool, hay-scented dark of the stable, he went to his small room upstairs. He kicked open the door and went directly to the loose floorboard beneath his cot. From the hollow space, he pulled out a long, oilcloth-wrapped bundle. His hand steady now, for the first time in years, unwrapped it. There lay his gun belt, the leather cracked and dry, the holster molded to the shape of the Colt Peacemaker that rested within. The metal was cool to the touch, heavy with the weight of his past. He strapped it on. The familiar pressure at his hip felt less like a burden and more like an anchor. He was no longer adrift. He checked the action of the Colt, the cylinder spinning with a clean metallic whisper. He loaded it, each cartridge sliding into place with a satisfying click, a sound like a promise being made. He had 6 shots. He figured he would only need 1. Downstairs, his horse, a stoic buckskin named Ghost, nickered softly as he approached. Jedediah saddled the animal with an efficiency born of long practice. As he worked, the memories came not as paralyzing waves of grief, but as sharp focusing points of rage. Sarah, her laughter echoing in the small home they had built. Their son Samuel, his small hand tucked into Jedediah's, the locket resting against Sarah's throat. Silas Thorne had taken more than silver. He had taken the last untainted image Jedediah had of his wife. Sheriff Brody found him tightening the cinch on Ghost's saddle. "Kane, you're not thinking of going after them alone, are you? That's Silas Thorne's gang. They're killers." Jedediah didn't look at him. "This isn't your fight, Brody." "The hell it isn't. He robbed my town." Brody puffed out his chest. "We're forming a posse. You should join us. We'll have a better chance together." Jedediah finally turned, and the look in his eyes made the sheriff take an involuntary step back. It was the look of a man who had already buried everything he had to lose. "A posse will be slow." Jedediah set his voice a low gravel. "They'll follow the main trail, kick up dust, and announce they're coming for miles. Thorne will be in the next territory before you've cleared the county line. I'm not looking to chase him. I'm looking to find him." He swung into the saddle. He had a canteen, a rifle in its scabbard, and the clothes on his back. It was all he needed. He knew this land knew its secrets and its cruelties. But tracking 4 men across the Arizona Badlands required more than just knowledge of the terrain. It required an artist. His destination was not the trail leading out of town, but a camp tucked away by Willow Creek, a place the townsfolk avoided. It was the home of a man who could read the desert like other men read books, a man who could track a whisper on the wind. An Apache tracker the locals spoke of with a mix of fear and reverence. The ride to Willow Creek was a descent into a wilder world. The last vestiges of redemption fell away, replaced by a landscape of splintered rock that tore at boot leather and skeletal cacti that clawed at the sky. The wind whispered through them, a lonely, mournful sound. Jedediah felt at home here. This desolation mirrored the landscape of his own soul. He found the camp just as the sun began to bleed across the western horizon. A thin plume of smoke rose from a small contained fire. Beside it sat a man carved from the desert itself, his features sharp angles and sun-darkened skin, his long black hair braided with leather. His name was Cale. He looked up as Jedediah approached, his eyes dark and ancient, holding the accumulated wisdom of a people who had called this harsh land home for centuries. His hand rested near the knife at his belt, a casual gesture that was anything but. "You are far from your town, Marshal," Kyle said. He used the old title, though his voice was flat, neither respectful nor mocking. His English was deliberate, each word chosen with care. "I'm not a marshal anymore," Jedediah said, dismounting. "I need a tracker." "The world is full of trackers," Kyle replied, his gaze unwavering. "Most are not worth the price of their own horses. They say you can follow a man across solid rock." Cale's expression didn't change. "The rock tells a story to those who listen. What story do you wish to read?" 4 men. They robbed the bank in redemption. They're led by a man named Silas Thorne. Jedediah reached into his pocket and pulled out a roll of bills, most of what he had in the world. He placed it on a flat rock between them. "I want the man who leads them. The others don't matter. I just want him." Cale looked at the money, then back at Jedediah's face. His eyes seemed to see past the weathered skin and into the raw, burning grief beneath. "This is not about stolen money." He stated not a question, but a conclusion. "This is a hunt of the heart. Those are the most dangerous. Will you do it?" Cale was silent for a long time, studying the fire as if the dancing flames held an answer. A man who hunts with such sorrow in his spirit leaves a trail of his own, he said softly. The land will feel his pain. Following him will be like following a ghost. It can lead a tracker to dark places. He finally looked up, his decision made. "I will read the story the land tells. But you must understand the desert keeps many secrets. You may not like the ending of this one." He ignored the money on the rock. "Payment will be decided when the story's finished." They left at first light. The desert dawn broke like a blade across the horizon, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold. Kyle led the way, his movements fluid and economical, a part of the landscape, rather than an intruder upon it. He didn't follow the main road where a posse would search. Instead, he cut across country, his eyes scanning the ground, the sky, the subtle language of the wilderness. Within an hour, he found the trail. 4 horses, he said, kneeling beside a series of prints in a sandy wash. They rode hard but not panicked. They believe they are not being followed. He touched a broken stem of sagebrush. The leader rides with a heavy heart. His horse feels it. The animal steps with a weariness that does not match the speed of its travel. Jedediah frowned. A heavy heart, he's a bank robber and a killer. A man's spirit has weight, Kyle said, rising and continuing on. It presses down. The ground feels it. This man, he is not running from something. He is riding toward it. The observation unsettled Jedediah. He had imagined Thorn as a simple, greedy outlaw, but Cale's words painted a different picture, one that hinted at a purpose beyond theft. The thought was a splinter in his mind, worrisome and sharp. They rode for hours under the merciless sun. The trail was a master class in evasion. Thorn's gang had split up, rejoined, and used rocky ground to hide their tracks, all the classic tricks of men on the run. But Cale was not a classic tracker. He seemed to follow an invisible thread, reading signs. Jedediah couldn't see a displaced pebble, the flight pattern of a hawk, the scent on the wind. Late in the afternoon, Cale stopped, holding up a hand. They were in a shallow canyon, the red rock walls closing in around them. He was here, Cale said, his voice low. Jedediah saw nothing but rock and sand. Who? The one you hunt. Cale pointed to the canyon wall. Scratched into the sandstone, almost invisible, was a single letter S. Below it was a date from 10 years ago. Jedediah's blood ran cold. He knew this place. It was called Serpent's Maw. 10 years ago, he and his brother Silas had cornered a band of rustlers here. It was one of their first major arrests as deputies. A day of triumph of two brothers standing shoulder to shoulder against the lawless frontier. Why would he stop here? Jedediah whispered, his voice hoarse. This is not a trail of flight. Cale said, his eyes meeting Jedediah's. It is a pilgrimage. He is not running from you, Marshal. He is leading you. The realization struck Jedediah with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't a chase. It was a carefully orchestrated journey into his own past. Silas Thorn knew who he was. He knew where he had been. Every step of this hunt was a step deeper into the memories Jedediah had tried so hard to bury. The locket wasn't a random piece of loot. It was a key unlocking a door to a past he thought was sealed forever. And on the other side of that door, a ghost was waiting. His ghost. The sun beat down, but Jedediah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. The crimson dust of the Badlands began to feel less like dirt and more like dried blood. They were on a trail of memory, and Jedediah had a terrible feeling he knew where it would end, in the heart of the fire that had consumed his world. The pilgrimage continued. Each day drew them deeper into the unforgiving wilderness and further back into Jedediah's fractured past. Cale moved with a silent, unnerving grace, reading the land as if it were a sacred text written only for him. He spoke little, but his observations were like stones dropped into the still pool of Jedediah's grief, sending ripples through his long-held certainties. The man you hunt. Silas Thorn. He does not treat the land as an enemy. Cale noted as they made camp one evening, the sky a vast canvas of bruised purple and fading orange. He moves with it, not against it. He respects its power. This is not the way of a common thief. Jedediah cleaned his Colt, the repetitive mechanical action, a small comfort against the rising tide of his unease. He's a killer, Kyle. Nothing more. Cale added a piece of dried mesquite to their small fire. The flames leaped, casting dancing shadows across his weathered face. There are many ways to kill a man, Jedediah Kane. Some use a bullet. Others use memory. The next day, the trail led them to the ruins of a small homestead, a collapsed adobe structure slowly being reclaimed by the desert. The scorched timbers of the roof were stark against the sky, a monument to some forgotten tragedy. Jedediah reined Ghost to a halt, his knuckles white on the leather. He knew this place too. It was the Miller farm. 10 years ago, a fire, another fire, had swept through, taking the family with it. Jedediah and his brother Silas had been the first lawmen on the scene. He remembered the smell of burnt wood and despair, the sight of his young brother, his face pale and grim, helping him carry out the bodies. In the cold ashes of the homestead's hearth, someone had recently camped. Kyle knelt sifting through the soot with his fingertips. He pulled out a small metal object, a deputy's badge tarnished and bent, the star points dulled with age and heat. It was the same type of badge Jedediah and Silas had worn. "He wants you to remember." Cale said, his voice soft but resonant in the eerie silence. "He is not destroying your past. He is forcing you to rebuild it, piece by painful piece." The journey became a torturous litany of ghosts. They passed through the ghost town of Perdition, where Jedediah had taken his first bullet in a shootout. Thorne had stopped there, leaving behind a spent cartridge on the threshold of the abandoned saloon. They crossed the Cinder River at the exact spot where Jedediah had nearly drowned, chasing a fugitive, a story he'd often told his wife Sarah, who had called him a fool, and then kissed his scars. On a rock by the riverbank, Thorne had left a single waterlogged playing card, the Queen of Hearts, Sarah's favorite. With each stop, each cruel memento, the image of Silas Thorne, the faceless outlaw, began to blur. In his place, a more terrible suspicion started to form, a thought so monstrous, Jedediah tried to push it away, but it clung to him like a shroud. This was not the work of a stranger. This was intimate. This was personal. This was family. To escape his thoughts, Jedediah rode harder, pushing himself and his horse to the brink of exhaustion. He tried to focus on the mechanics of the hunt, on the image of the locket, on the cold satisfaction of the revenge he would take. But at night, huddled by the fire while Kyle kept watch, the dreams came. He was in the fire again, the real fire, the one that had taken everything. Smoke choked him, flames licked at him, and through the roaring inferno, he saw two sets of eyes watching him. Sarah's full of love and terror, and another's full of accusation. One afternoon, they stopped to water their horses in a town called Last Chance, a desperate collection of tents and clapboard buildings that had sprung up around a rumored silver strike. The air was thick with greed and cheap whiskey. As Jedediah filled their canteens, he saw an old familiar face leaning against the assay office. It was Marcus Blackwood, a retired sheriff, who had given Jedediah and his brother their first jobs as deputies. His hair was white now, and his back was stooped, but his eyes were as sharp as ever. "Jedediah Kane?" Blackwood said, his voice a dry rasp. "I heard you were living like a hermit in Redemption. Didn't figure you for the sociable type anymore." "Just passing through, Marcus." Jedediah said, not wanting to get drawn into a conversation. "Chasing someone." Blackwood's eyes flicked to the Colt at Jedediah's hip. "Haven't seen you wear that in a long time." He paused, his gaze turning sad. "You know, I still think about that fire. What it did to you, to your family." He shook his head slowly. "Tragic business. You weren't the only one who lost everything in that fire, you know. Your brother, losing his fiancée like that on top of your own wife and child. It's a wonder either of you survived." Jedediah froze. "What are you talking about, Silas's fiancée?" Blackwood looked confused. "Amelia, the school teacher. Sweet girl. They were to be married in the spring. Don't you remember she was visiting with Sarah that night when the fire broke out? Silas nearly tore the whole town apart trying to get back inside for her. His face clouded. Poor kid. We all thought he died in there with her. Found what was left of a body near hers. We all just assumed. A man can only take so much. The world tilted on its axis. Jedediah's memory of that night was a nightmare of smoke, heat, and panic. He remembered pulling Sarah's body from the flames, remembered his own, burns the collapse of the roof. But Amelia, Silas's fiancée, he had no clear memory of her being there. The trauma had seared it from his mind, leaving only the gaping wound of his own loss. He stumbled away from Blackwood, his mind reeling. He found Cale waiting by the horses, his expression patient, knowing. "You knew," Jedediah accused, his voice ragged. "I read the story the land tells," Kyle replied calmly. "The trail does not belong to one man's sorrow. It is shared. Two sets of footprints walking the same path of pain." That night, they followed the tracks to their most devastating stop yet, the blackened skeletal remains of the house Jedediah had built for his family. It stood on a hill overlooking a valley, a place that had once been his heaven and was now his hell. 10 years had passed, but the scar on the landscape remained. Thorne's trail led directly to the center of the ruins, to the spot where the hearth had once stood. There in the ashes was a small fireproof lockbox that Jedediah recognized. It was the one he and Silas had shared as boys, where they kept their treasures. It had been stored in the house, and he had assumed it was lost in the fire. With trembling hands, Jedediah knelt and opened it. Inside, resting on a bed of velvet, were 2 items. The first was a photograph, its edges charred, but the center image hauntingly clear. It showed 2 young men in deputy uniforms, arms slung around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera. A younger, happier Jedediah stood next to his brother Silas Kane. The second item was a letter, the paper yellowed and brittle. The handwriting was his brother's. "Jedediah, I watched you from the trees that night. I saw you run from the house. I saw you carry her out. But you didn't come back. You left them. You left my Amelia to burn. They called you a hero, a grieving hero who tried his best. But I know the truth. You saved yourself. For 10 years, I have let you live with your lies, marinating in your so-called grief. But a debt is owed, not in money, but in memory. I will make you walk the path we walked together. I will make you see what you chose to forget. And when you have remembered everything, I will come for you." I took back Amelia's locket. It was all I had left of her. You didn't even recognize it, did you? You were so busy drowning in your own sorrow, you forgot hers. You forgot mine. I am not Silas Thorne. I am the ghost you created. In your brother Silas. The name hit Jedediah with the force of a physical blow. Silas Thorne. Silas Kane. His brother. The boy he had grown up with, the man he had stood beside, was alive. Alive and consumed by a decade of hatred, believing Jedediah had abandoned their loved ones to die. The truth crashed down on him, brutal and absolute. The man he was hunting was not a stranger. He was his own flesh and blood. The robbery wasn't for money. The locket wasn't his wife's. It was Amelia's. This entire journey was a reckoning orchestrated by a brother who believed he had been betrayed in the most unforgivable way. Jedediah looked up from the letter, his eyes finding Cale's in the fading light. The rage that had fueled him for days evaporated, leaving behind a cold, hollow ache. The quest for vengeance was over. A different, more terrible mission had just begun. He had to face his brother. He had to face the truth of the fire. And most terrifying of all, he had to face the possibility that Silas was right. The ashes of the old house felt like a grave, and Jedediah was the ghost who haunted it. He stood amidst the ruins of his former life, the letter from Silas clutched in his hand, its words searing themselves into his soul. The simple, righteous anger that had driven him from redemption was gone, replaced by a tangled knot of guilt, confusion, and a profound bone-deep sorrow. His brother was alive. His brother hated him, and perhaps he had reason too. What is your story of the fire? Jedediah Kane. Cale asked, his voice cutting through the heavy silence. He stood a respectful distance away, a sentinel in the twilight, his presence a quiet challenge. Jedediah's mind fractured memories returning in sharp, painful shards. The heat so intense it felt like a living thing. The smoke a black choking shroud. He remembered finding Sarah, her body still, his world ending in that instant. He remembered dragging her out, the flames clawing at his back. He remembered the roof groaning, the sound of a world collapsing. He remembered shouting Silas's name and Amelia's, but his voice was swallowed by the inferno. And then, nothing. A void. The next thing he knew, he was lying on the grass outside the house, a roaring pyre, and men were holding him back. I tried. Jedediah stammered the words, tasting like ash in his mouth. I thought he was dead. They said he was dead. The story you tell yourself is not always the true one. Kyle set his gaze fixed on the horizon. A man can be a hero in his own mind and a coward in another's. Your brother has been telling himself his story for 10 years. Now he wants you to hear it. The hunt was no longer a pursuit. It was an appointment. Silas was not running, he was waiting. The trail from the burned-out house was clear and deliberate, as if Silas no longer cared about hiding his tracks. He was reeling his brother and pulling him toward a final terrible confrontation. The landscape they traveled through became a reflection of Jedediah's inner turmoil. They rode through canyons where the shadows were as sharp as knives, and across plains where the wind howled like a soul in torment. Jedediah was silent, lost in the labyrinth of his own memory, trying to piece together the truth of that night. Was he a hero who had been overcome by the flames? Or was he a man who, in a moment of sheer primal terror, had saved himself and left the others to their fate? He couldn't be sure. The trauma had burned a hole in his memory, and Silas had spent a decade filling it with hatred and blame. Silas's messages became more direct, more cruel. He left a child's worn leather ball identical to one Jedediah's son Samuel had cherished on the trail. Later they found a woman's shawl the same pale blue as one Sarah had knitted, caught on the branches of a withered tree. He was no longer just reminding Jedediah of their shared past. He was twisting the knife of Jedediah's personal loss, punishing him for his perceived sins. He wants to unmake you, Kyle observed as they found the shawl. Before he kills you, he wants to strip away the man you believe yourself to be, until only the guilt remains. The realization was a cold dread in the pit of Jedediah's stomach. This was more than revenge. It was a methodical deconstruction of his identity. Silas was not just going to kill his body, he was going to execute his soul first. Cale's role shifted from tracker to something more akin to a spiritual guide. He seemed to understand the weight Jedediah was carrying, the internal war he was fighting. He didn't offer sympathy, but his quiet presence was a steadying force. He spoke of the Apache belief in facing one's ghosts, of the idea that a man could not be free until he had looked his own spirit in the eye and accepted what he saw there, good and bad. Your brother follows a path of vengeance, Kyle said one night as they sat by the fire. It is a straight line that ends in a grave. Your path has become crooked. It twists and turns back on itself. This is the path of understanding. It is harder to walk, but it may not lead to the same dark place. Finally, the trail led them to the border of the Badlands, a desolate, storm-scarred region where the earth was cracked and broken. In the distance, silhouetted against a sky bruised with the promise of a storm, stood a lone structure, an abandoned church, its steeple a skeletal finger pointing toward the heavens. He is there. Kyle said, his voice a low hum. He has chosen the place of judgment. He looked at Jedediah, his dark eyes filled with a solemn understanding. This is a story you must finish alone, Jedediah Kane. My part in it is over. Jedediah nodded, a lump forming in his throat. Thank you, Kale. Do not thank me yet, the tracker replied. Find the truth. It is the only thing that can set a man free even in death. With a final silent nod, Kale turned his horse and melted back into the wilderness, leaving Jedediah to face his destiny. As Jedediah rode toward the church, the sky opened up. The rain came first, a few fat drops that spattered in the dust, then a torrential downpour that turned the world to a gray, blurry haze. Thunder cracked overhead, a sound like the sky itself breaking apart, and lightning split, the darkness illuminating the stark, lonely church in flashes of brilliant, ghostly light. He dismounted at the crumbling steps, Ghost shivering and snorting nervously in the deluge. The heavy wooden doors of the church were ajar, creaking on rusted hinges. Jedediah drew his colt, the metal slick with rain, and stepped inside. The interior was a cavern of shadows and decay. Pews were overturned, and the altar was covered in a thick layer of dust, and the wind howled through the broken stained-glass windows, creating a symphony of mournful sounds. At the far end of the nave, standing before the ruined altar, was a figure cloaked in darkness. As lightning flashed, the figure was thrown into sharp relief. It was Silas. He was taller and thinner than Jedediah remembered his movements, possessing a predator's lethal grace. He wore the same black duster from the robbery, but his face was uncovered now. The right side was a horrific mask of scar tissue, the skin melted and pulled taut, a permanent gruesome reminder of the fire. His left eye, the one that was untouched, burned with a cold, intelligent light. "Brother," Silas said, his voice smooth and articulate, yet utterly devoid of warmth. "I was beginning to think you'd lost the trail, or perhaps your courage." "Silas." Jedediah breathed the name, a painful foreign thing on his tongue. "It's true. You're alive." "Alive is a matter of perspective," Silas said, taking a slow step forward. Rainwater dripped from the ceiling, each drop echoing in the vast, empty space. "The man I was died in that fire. You made sure of that. What's left is simply an instrument of his memory, an instrument of justice." "It wasn't like that," Jedediah said, his voice pleading. "The roof was coming down. I couldn't get back in." "Couldn't or wouldn't?" Silas sneered, the scarred side of his face twisting into a grotesque parody of a smile. "You ran, Jedediah. I saw you. You saved yourself and the hero's story that came with it. The brave Marshal Kane who lost everything but his own life." He gestured around the ruined church. "I chose this place because it is a house of lies, a place where men confess their sins and pretend they are forgiven. There is no forgiveness for what you did. There is only payment." Silas slowly unbuttoned his duster. Strapped to his hip was a gun belt, a silver-plated revolver resting in the holster. It was a mirror image of Jedediah's own setup. Two brothers, two guns, and a decade of pain standing between them. The storm raged outside the thunder, a percussive beat counting down the final moments. This was it. The culmination of the pilgrimage. A final confrontation in a storm-swept church, where the only sermon would be delivered by gunfire and the only absolution would be death. Jedediah raised his Colt, his hand steady despite the trembling in his soul. The man before him was his brother, but he was also a monster of his own making, a ghost demanding a reckoning. And Jedediah knew with chilling certainty that only one of them would walk out of this church alive. The air in the church was thick with the weight of unspoken history, charged and heavy like the storm-filled sky outside. Every clap of thunder seemed to punctuate the silence between the brothers, each flash of lightning a stark, momentary judgment on their broken faces. "You took Amelia's locket." Jedediah set his voice low and steady, forcing himself to meet his brother's burning gaze. "All this time, I thought it was Sarah's. The fire. It took so much, Silas. My memories are smoke and shadows." Convenient. Silas hissed his good hand, clenching and unclenching at his side. "You buried your guilt so deep, you forgot the name of the woman I loved. The woman you left to die beside your own wife." He took another deliberate step forward, the sound of his boots on the grimy floor echoing like a drum beat. "But I remember everything. I remember the smell of her hair. I remember the sound of her laughter. And I remember her screams as the flames took her. I heard them, Jedediah, even as you were outside being hailed as a hero." That's not the truth." Jedediah yelled, his voice cracking with an agony that was 10 years old. "I screamed for you both. I tried to go back." "Lies." Silas roared the sound, swallowed by a deafening peal of thunder. He drew his silver-plated revolver in a motion that was unnervingly fast, a blur of deadly intent. "You built a new life on a foundation of lies while I was reborn in the ashes of your cowardice." Jedediah reacted on pure instinct, the muscle memory of 1,000 gunfights taking over. He dropped and rolled behind a shattered pew as Silas's first shot splintered the wood where his head had been. The roar of the gun inside the church was deafening, a physical blow to the ears. He came up firing, not aiming to kill, but to disarm, to stop this madness. His bullet struck the altar behind Silas, sending a shower of stone chips into the air. This was a dance of death they both knew well, a choreography learned in their youth, now perverted into a duel between ghosts. Lightning flashed again, illuminating the cavernous space. Silas had vanished. Jedediah's heart pounded in his chest. He scanned the shadows, the overturned pews, the dark confessionals. His brother had always been the quicker of the two, the more cunning. "Do you remember the night we chased the Dalton gang into the old mines?" Silas's voice echoed from the darkness, disembodied and chilling. "You were so certain of your path, so sure of what was right. You walked straight into their trap. I had to pull you out. I always had to save you from your own blind righteousness." Jedediah moved silently, using the storm's fury to cover the sound of his footsteps. He edged along the wall, his back pressed against the cold, damp stone. "This isn't about that, Silas. This is about a fire and a railroad baron who got away with murder." "The baron..." Silas laughed, a hollow, bitter sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "He was just the instrument. You were the cause. Your ambition, your need to be the hero, pushed us into that fight before we were ready. You got them killed, Jedediah, your wife, your son, my Amelia. Their blood is on your hands as much as his." A shot rang out from the choir loft above. The bullet ricocheted off the floor inches from Jedediah's boot. He fired back into the darkness of the loft, the muzzle flash, a brief, violent star. He heard a grunt of pain, followed by a curse. He had hit him. He used the moment to charge forward, taking cover behind the stone pulpit. He reloaded his Colt, his fingers numb, his mind racing. He had to end this. He couldn't kill his brother, but he couldn't let this monster of vengeance walk free. "It's over, Silas," he yelled, his voice raw. "Put down the gun. We can tell them the truth. We can go after the Baron together like we should have 10 years ago." Silas emerged from the shadows of the stairs leading down from the loft. He was limping, a dark stain spreading on his pant leg, but the gun in his hand was steady. The look on his scarred face was one of pure, undiluted hatred. "Together," he spat. "There is no together. There is only the debt you owe me. A life for a life. No, 3 lives for the one you saved." He raised his pistol. Jedediah raised his. For a heartbeat, they were frozen in time. 2 brothers' reflections of the same tragedy, locked in a standoff at the heart of a storm. The years fell away, and Jedediah saw not the disfigured killer, but the face of the boy he had fished with the young man who had been his partner, his best friend. "Don't make me do this, Silas," he pleaded, tears mixing with the sweat and rain on his face. Silas's lips twisted into that horrifying smile. "You already did," he whispered. 10 years ago. He fired. Jedediah fired. The 2 shots sounded as one, a single final clap of thunder in the dying storm. Silas staggered back, a red flower blooming on the chest of his black duster. His gun slipped from his fingers, clattering onto the stone floor. He looked down at his wound, then up at Jedediah, a flicker of surprise in his one good eye. He slumped against the altar, sliding down to the floor, leaving a crimson smear on the stone. Jedediah stood frozen, the smoke curling from the barrel of his Colt. He felt a searing pain in his left shoulder, a fire that spread down his arm. He'd been hit. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the gaping chasm that had just opened in his soul. He had killed his brother. He stumbled forward, his own wound forgotten, and knelt beside Silas. The hatred was gone from his brother's face, replaced by a weary, hollow look. Silas's breath came in ragged, shallow gasps. "You didn't even hesitate." Silas rasped, a bloody froth on his lips. "Always the marshal. I never wanted this." Jedediah choked out, pressing his hand against the wound, a futile, desperate gesture. "Silas, I'm sorry. For all of it. I'm so sorry." Silas coughed, his body convulsing. He reached a trembling hand inside his duster and pulled out the silver locket. He pressed it into Jedediah's hand. "For Amelia," he whispered, his voice fading. "Make sure she's remembered." His eyes, once burning with a decade of rage, glazed over and became still. The storm outside began to subside, the thunder receding into a low rumble, the rain softening to a gentle patter. In the quiet aftermath, the only sound was the ragged, broken sobbing of Jedediah Kane, kneeling in a ruined church over the body of the brother he had just killed. He was no longer a hero. He was no longer a victim. He was just a man alone with the full, terrible weight of the truth. The vengeance he had sought was a bitter poison, and the victory was nothing but another, deeper loss. The cycle of violence was over, but the silence it left behind was deafening. The rain stopped. A sliver of pale morning light pierced through the broken clouds, shining through a shattered window and illuminating the tragic scene. Jedediah Kane, the marshal, the ghost, the brother, was left with the ghosts of 2 families and the locket of a woman he had failed to save. The railroad baron, the man who had lit the fuse on this whole tragedy, was still out there, powerful and untouched. There was no perfect justice in this world. There was only the wreckage. Jedediah pushed himself to his feet, and the pain in his shoulder a dull, throbbing reminder of the morning's violence. He looked at Silas, at the brother whose pain he had never truly understood until it was too late. With a heavy heart, he carried his brother's body out of the church and laid him to rest in the small, forgotten cemetery behind it, burying him under a simple wooden cross. There were no words to say, no prayers to offer. There was only the somber duty of a survivor. He rode away from the church, the silver locket clutched in his hand. He didn't ride back to redemption. His path lay elsewhere. He journeyed for days, his wound healing, his spirit aching. He rode back through the ghost towns and scorched homesteads, but now he saw them not as monuments to his pain, but as shared ground of a tragedy that belonged to them both. His journey ended in the town where it all began, where the fire had taken everything. He walked through the quiet streets, a stranger in a place that was once his home. He went to the cemetery, a place he had avoided for 10 long years. He found the graves easily. Sarah Kane, Samuel Kane. The headstones were weathered but clear. He knelt, tracing the letters of their names with his fingertips. For a long time he just stayed there, letting the decade of unspoken grief wash over him. The tears that came were not of rage or self-pity, but of a quiet, profound sorrow. Then he stood up and walked to a different part of the cemetery, to a section of unmarked plots. He remembered now what Marcus Blackwood had said. He found the small, simple stone that marked the resting place of Amelia Silas's fiancée, a grave he had never once visited. Beside it was an empty, overgrown plot, the place where the town had buried the unidentifiable remains they had assumed were his brother's. He didn't place the silver locket on his wife's grave. With a deliberate, solemn motion, he knelt and gently placed it on the earth of Amelia's plot. It glinted in the afternoon sun, a small, beautiful tribute to a love he had forgotten, and a life that had been lost in the shadow of his own tragedy. It was an apology, an act of remembrance, an acknowledgement of a shared sorrow. He was finally seeing the whole story. He stood there for a long time, a man stripped bare of his illusions. He was not the hero of the story. He was not the villain. He was just a man who had survived, and who now had to figure out how to live with the ghosts he had finally faced. The fire had taken his family, and vengeance had taken his brother. All that was left was a quiet, empty space inside him. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the graves, Jedediah Kane turned and walked away. He didn't know where he was going. He was no longer running from his past, but he was not yet running toward a future. He was simply walking one step at a time, a man who had made a pilgrimage through hell and had come out the other side, not redeemed, not healed, but finally terribly free. His departure from the town was one of quiet purpose, the end of a long and bloody chapter. The world was still an unjust place, but his war was over. The cycle of violence had been broken, paid for in blood and sorrow.